Hello, good afternoon, all. You're very welcome to our webinar today on how to measure Scope 3 emissions as a part of Enterprise Ireland's Green Transition Webinar Series 2024. My name is Ankush Shirsat, and I'm the executive in the Sustainability and Renewable Energy Department here in Enterprise Ireland. We are hosting today's webinar in collaboration with Carbon Track. We are joined by Fergal Mee, Environmental Director of Carbon Track. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording and the slides afterwards. We welcome you to submit the questions throughout the webinar and we will have at the end the Q&A. So please input your questions into the Q&A at any time during the webinar. The Climate Action Plan 2023-2024 sets out how the national targets will be achieved, and the target for enterprise sector is to reduce the emissions by 35% by 2030 from a 2018 baseline. One of the key steps in developing sustainability strategy and action map was highlighted on our first webinar of this series, and it was the baseline review, looking at your own carbon footprint, what your emissions are at the moment. Because if you don't know what your emissions are, you can't really figure out how to reduce them. For many businesses, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions and cost reduction opportunities can lie outside their own operations, and therefore addressing Scope 3 emissions can help advance organizations' decarbonization and sustainability journey. Measuring Scope 3 emissions can be a challenging process for any company, large or small. So today, Fergal will talk us through how to measure the Scope 3 emissions, and hopefully we will all walk away with a deeper understanding of how to measure the Scope 3 emissions and how to think of improving the measurement over time. So it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Fergal Mee. Fergal is an environmental director and heads up the environmental practice at Carbon Track. Carbon Track is a leading provider of ISO 14064 and carbon consultancy and training services in the UK and Ireland. Fergal was instrumental in rolling out the ISO 14064 suite of courses on carbon emission quantification, reduction, validation, and verification throughout the Europe and overseas. Fergal also worked in the UK mandatory carbon reporting schemes, and he has also worked in similar schemes around Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Asia. Fergal is a member of a committee that involves participation in the ISO standard development. He has worked on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint projects throughout the Europe, North America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia. So Fergal, I'm going to hand over to you and stop sharing my screen. So over to you, Fergal. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ankush, and thank you to everybody in attendance. I'll now share my screen, so bear with me for one moment, please. And I now believe, or sincerely hope, that my screen is visible to everybody.
Yeah, it's there now, Fergal. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. So good afternoon again, everybody, as Ankush, and thank you, Ankush, for the very nice introduction. Yes, I would classify myself more of a student rather than an expert, you know, but we would classify ourselves as fourth-year students at least, rather than experts. So we have been involved in greenhouse gas quantification, greenhouse gas emission reduction projects, greenhouse gas carbon dioxide removal projects, and validation and verification of various greenhouse gas claims and assertions. So with the presentation, let me commence. So Enterprise Ireland, again, are the organisers of these series of webinars. So I'll start off, ladies and gentlemen, with a question. But please don't answer the question immediately if you do know the answer. And as you can see, we've got a nice decorative garden pond on the screen there, being attended to by a gardening person. Very nice pond lilies. But the pond lilies double in size every day on the surface of the water. So they double in size every day. The question is, if it takes 50 days to cover the entire pond, how long will it take to cover half the pond? If you do know the answer, please, we'll come to that at the end. But the reason we use this analogy is because it is akin to the climate change problem. We believe The problem is progressing slowly and is not an immediate and clear and present danger to our economies and our way of life and our way of living, when in fact it is. But it is coming up upon us unnoticed unless we take uh, significant greenhouse gas climate mitigation actions. So I shall press on following my posing of the question to you guys. So our story, we're a consultancy business, as Ankush has kindly described us. We are involved in training. We have offices in Cork, Dublin, and London. I put those towns in alphabetical order rather than order of primacy, just in case anyone is getting concerned as to the order of the towns mentioned. We have a strategic alliance partnership with the Canadian Standards Association, who were instrumental in developing greenhouse gas standards. I'm a member of ISO's Technical Committee 207, which deals with greenhouse gas management and mitigation. We work across all sectors. We work on every continent except Antarctica is the only continent we haven't carried out any significant or any projects whatsoever in. And we do training and consultancy work on carbon management programs: China, Kazakhstan, the Republic of South Africa, the Republic of Singapore, Federal Republic of Nigeria, the Republic of Turkey, and also, of course, in North America and throughout the European Union. I guess it's important, as we're discussing Scope 3 emissions, maybe to describe what, in fact, a Scope 3 emission is. So the diagram here is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it describes various types of greenhouse gas emissions. So those of which we would be familiar with would be Scope 1, or as ISO 14064 would refer to these emissions as direct emissions. The terms Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 are jargon known only to the cognoscenti. ISO is a standards-based organization and wants everyone to have as much information as possible. So ISO uses the term direct emissions for Scope 1. So Scope 1 would be emissions from company facilities or landfills. If we're a landfill operator, we have direct emissions through the volatilization of organic material in the form of carbon dioxide and methane from our landfill sites. If we're a gas company operator, a gas distributor, we have direct Scope 1 emissions from leakages and losses in the gas pipeline, compressor stations, storage stations, metering facilities, and so forth. You'll have noticed I mentioned two types of Scope 1 emissions there, which are not related to combustion at all. So it's also important to remember on Scope 1 that it's not all combustion or energy related. We have other Scope 1 emissions. Direct product emissions from the calcination step in cement manufacturing, catalytic cracking in petrochemical manufacturing, all lead to Scope 1 direct emissions. Scope 2 are indirect, or as ISO would call them, energy indirect. These are emissions which occur at a power transformation site by virtue of the fact that we consume power in our facility, such as electricity to power our elevators, motors, pumps, compressors, computers, laptops, laboratory instruments, lighting, heating. So these would be Scope 2 or energy indirect, as they would be referred to by the greenhouse or by the ISO standard. In addition to Scope 2 electricity, which is the commonly known one, if we purchase steam, if we purchase hot water from a district heating plant, these will also be quantified to our Scope 2 emissions. And then we have Scope 3 emissions, recalling again, the scope word is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. These are indirect emissions. ISO 14064 and the ISO Greenhouse Gas Standards will refer to these as other indirect, whereas Scope 2 would be energy indirect. Scope 3 here again on the upstream activities are other indirect emissions. These are emissions which are not Scope 1 and Scope 2. So what do these emission sources come from? Employee commuting, business travel, waste generated by our operations, which are handled, treated, disposed, and recycled by other organizations, transportation and distribution of our materials to our production sites, so raw materials, for example, pig iron or iron ore to our iron foundries, iron to our steel mills, fuel energy related activities, capital goods. If we purchase a new machine, the emissions associated with that device. If we're a newspaper and we buy a printing press, well, the emissions associated with manufacturing that printing press. with shipping that printing press from site of manufacture to Dublin, for example. These would be all emissions which would be quantified and included in our Scope 3 reporting. If we build a wind farm in the west of Ireland, we need to quantify the Scope 3 emissions associated with manufacturing, the components, the nacelle, the blades, the tower, maybe in China. Many of these devices come from China, so the emissions involved in manufacturing that wind tower and its components in the People's Republic of China are included in our Scope 3 emissions, as indeed are the emissions associated by the marine shipping from, say, the port of Ningbo in China to the port of Foynes in Ireland. That's between 41 and 47 days at sea, burning fossil fuels. So the emissions from that are a significant chunk of our Scope 3 emissions, and we should include them where we can get the data. Purchased goods and services. If we're a pharmaceutical laboratory or a research and development lab in the pharmaceutical or healthcare sector, and we need to buy laboratory rabbits, and mice, and daphne and test animals. Well, the production of those animals by a laboratory supplier are also part of our Scope 2 emissions. Downstream, our emissions, leased assets, the scrapping of, if we're an auto manufacturer or a car manufacturer, when our car is scrapped at the end of 10 years or 20 years, the emissions associated with that scrapping operation need to be included. The use of sold products is a difficult Scope 3 emission to quantify. If I'm Mr. Sony TV and I make 20 million TV sets every year and ship them to all 5 continents, again, except Antarctica maybe, how do I work out the emissions associated with people running my TV sets in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, or Europe? Difficult. Each of those countries or jurisdictions will have a different grid electricity emission factor. The people will have different run times on their TV sets. How would Mr. Sony or Mr. whoever else makes TV sets work out the emissions from the use of our sold products with great difficulty? Processing of sold products, for example, if I'm a steel manufacturer and I ship steel to Toyota or Mercedes-Benz or Nissan, and they further process that steel into a car, these emissions should be included in my Scope 3 emissions, as are the transportation of my intermediate products or finished products to retail market. These are also should be included in my Scope 3 quantification. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there are quite a significant flock of Scope 3 emissions which do require, in the fullness of time, to be reported. However, maybe we can't do them all quite now, but we will get to how we would tackle the problems thereon. The most damaging greenhouse gases. This is a slide showing what are called GWPs, or global warming potential. This one is from the 5th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Today, we should be using the IPCC 6th assessment report, global warming potentials. So carbon dioxide, its chemical formula is 1 carbon, 2 oxygens. In the various UN or IPCC reports, it always has a value of 1. These numbers are dimensionless. They're a unitless number. These are ratios or relationships. The 1 represents the radiative forcing capacity of the gas carbon dioxide. We use that as the measurement or the comparator gas. Methane or methane, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens. You can see that has increased in intensity or global warming potential from 21 to 25 to 28. It's still 28 under the 6th assessment report. As the science becomes more clear and our understanding increases, the uncertainty levels reduce, although we never quite get rid of uncertainty in greenhouse gas work. Nitrous oxide, 2 nitrogens and an oxygen molecule. Again, that currently is around 265. Now that's a dimensionless number. This means that 1 ton of nitrous oxide emitted to the atmosphere is the same as 265 tons of CO2 equivalents. So if we avoid 1 ton of nitrous oxide entering the atmosphere, we do much better than avoiding 200 tons of carbon dioxide, because we actually remove 265 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. There are many, many gases which are listed in the 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment reports. This is just the top 3, as it were. Where do the gases come from? Well, carbon dioxide pre-industrial. This is the atmospheric concentration before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. We had 278 parts per million. Now we have approximately in 2021, 416 parts per million. The atmospheric lifetime, CO2 is variable. And the main activity sources by humans, fossil fuel, cement production, land use change. Methane has increased by almost threefold. However, it lasts in the atmosphere 12.4 years. Again, fossil fuels, rice paddies, waste dumps. Nitrous oxide has increased dramatically. Can last 109 years from fertilizers, combustion, agriculture, various hydrofluorocarbons. Again, all of these have gone from zero to significant numbers, and these predominantly come from refrigeration business. An interesting one there is PFC 14, which comes from aluminum production. And two which aren't shown here on the global warming chart would be SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, which has a global warming potential of 23,500. It est 1 ton of sulfur hexafluoride SF6 emitted to the atmosphere. It has the same global warming capacity as 23,500 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's a significant gas, which is used in the electrical industry. Aluminum smelting is again, and non-ferrous metals. Another gas which we use extensively in modern times, which is used in the manufacture of the glass on touchscreen mobile phones and tablets and such, has NF3, nitrogen trifluoride, a global warming potential of 16,000 tons or 16,500 tons. And we use a lot of that since 2007. So these gases are damaging to our environment and atmosphere. And they're all part of scopes 1, scope 2, and scope 3. We can see, and as I'm sure many of you will know already, since 1750, concentrations of these gases have increased respectively by 150, 260, and 124%. And since 1990, which is quite recently, our anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 57%, of which 73% of these are from fossil fuel consumption. So 27% are from non-combustion activities. The scopes of greenhouse gases, how many are in play? Well, we have direct emissions, as I mentioned. Greenhouse gas protocol uses the term scope 1. Indirect energy emissions, or purchases of electricity, steam, chilled water, hot water, scope 2, according to the greenhouse gas protocol. And scope 3 in the protocol are known as other indirect emissions in ISO speak, as it were. Of course, nothing in life is so simple. To add another complication, we have biofuels, biomass, biosolid, bioliquid, biogas. But the carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of these fuels are not included in our direct emissions or our scope 1 emissions, as you might expect. And in a further complication, as a watchmaker might call it, the methane and nitrous oxide from biofuel combustion are back calculated and then included again in our scope 1 or direct emissions, which is an interesting complication, as a watchmaker would call them. This is an example of scopes in just a sample warehousing or distribution company, for example. It's just by way of example. So the emissions in the dark surround boxes are direct or scope 1 emissions. So natural gas combustion in our buildings. Fuel combustion for company-owned and operated vehicles. These are our scope 1 emissions. Our indirect emissions from imported energy, which could be electricity, as we're all most probably aware, scope 2, imported steam for heating, or imported hot water for heating, or imported chilled water for cooling. These are scope 2 emissions. And then the scope 3 emissions are shown here. Transport emissions are shown in light grey, and services used by our company are shown in blue. But we could show them all the same color. These would be our scope 3 emissions in this example of a warehouse. How do we quantify our emissions? According to the greenhouse gas protocol, we identify our greenhouse gas sources. We select our calculation methodology. We obviously collect our activity data, and we choose emission factors. Emission factors typically in Ireland would come from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Internationally, we can get emission factors from the European Environment Agency out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And supranationally, I guess, we would use for national inventory report, we would use emission factors from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We do the math, we do the sums, and if we're a subsidiary, we would roll the data up to corporate level. So far, so good. It's very, very straightforward. Which classes or scopes of gases is it our responsibility to quantify, which is, I believe, an important question. Our direct emissions or scope 1, that's me, that's my business, my company. My energy indirect or scope 2 emissions, that's me, my company. If I purchase electricity, I must report my scope 2 emissions. If I purchase steam, I must report my scope 2 emissions. Other indirect, scope 3 emissions. I have to report some of them. My employee commuting, for example, my company's business travel, I would report those. Someone else would also have to report scope 3 emissions. For example, if I buy a ton of steel from a steel manufacturer, I may ask, quite legitimately, ask the steel manufacturer to please tell me what is the carbon footprint of a ton of steel which I purchase from you. So that's why I have to do some of the scope 3 calculations, and then I rely on the kindness and skill of others, suppliers, for example, to provide scope 3 emission numbers. Scope 1 emissions are from sources within our organizational boundaries or from sources which we own or control. Again, they're scope 2 typically related to our activities because the final energy format is consumed on our site. But the emissions are not controlled by us since they occur typically maybe at a power station or a CHP plant or a district heating plant. And again, I've just mentioned here already, I talked about steam purchases, hot water for heating purposes, chilled water for cooling, and maybe compressed air. So that's excluding electricity, but they're all part of our scope 2 emissions. In fact, we used to have an example of that in my hometown of Cork in south of Ireland many, many years ago, where we had a tire manufacturing company, Dunlop, and adjacent to the Dunlop tire plant was the Ford motor assembly business. One of them didn't have a boiler and purchased steam. I forget now whether it was Ford who purchased steam from Dunlop. Well, if that was today, that steam purchased by Ford from the Dunlop factory via pipeline through the fence would have been a scope 2 emission for the Ford Motor Company in Cork at the time. It's an interesting bit of industrial archaeology, I suppose, to bring that up. It's important to always try and keep in mind that my scope 3 emission are always either the scope 1 and or the scope 2 emissions of another organization. They don't just appear out of the blue. Sometimes we call them value chain emissions because our suppliers and maybe our customers for making intermediate products are all part of the one chain in which these emissions are involved. Some scope 3 emissions often overlap with other companies' emissions. Our strategies to reduce scope 2 emissions as well is a fruitful opportunity. We might identify synergies and ways to collaborate with our suppliers or indeed our customers to maybe make joint initiatives to reduce our scope 2 emissions. And you will find that in a lot of industrial cases. I'm aware of a waste management organization located in Western Europe. And that waste management company is very progressive in that they provide all of their customers with their scope 3 emissions for any waste they take from you. So they've carried out their own scope 1 and scope 2, and indeed their own scope 3 quantifications using ISO 14064 Part 1, and have had their emissions verified and do so annually according to ISO 14064 Part 3, which is the verification standard. And that waste company wins significant chunks of business from customers who wish to portray themselves and who wish to report as well accurately their own scope 3 emissions. This is from table 5.1 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol overview of scopes. So it just talks about, again, as I've mentioned, direct emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 are indirect emissions. Emissions from the generation of purchased or acquired electricity steam, as we've mentioned. Scope 3 are all indirect emissions, not including scope 2, that occur in the value chain of the reporting company, both upstream and downstream, as I've mentioned earlier. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has identified or defined 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 category 1, purchased goods, and there's a misspelling there, I must apologize. Purchased goods and services. capital goods, the acquisition of fuel and energy-related activities that haven't been accounted in our Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions. Upstream transportation and distribution, that's the delivery of steel to my car manufacturing plant, for example. Waste, I've mentioned already, waste which we generate in our operations and offices, how that is handled and processed leads to greenhouse gas emissions being emitted, and that's a Scope 3 emission for us. Business travel. So we travel on. So if I have a company and I'm a TV repair company, for example, and I have 2 vans in the business, 2 vehicles. I use one van to deliver TV sets to domestic residences, and that van also has a service engineer who goes out to repair TV sets. The second vehicle is a 4-door saloon car, which I use to travel to meetings, sales conferences, suppliers, and so forth. That's business travel in the 4-door sedan or 4-door saloon. That's business travel. Whereas my 4-door car, which has a company sign on the side of it, which delivers a serviceman to a customer site to carry out repairs or to deliver a spare part for a TV set, that's a Scope 1 emission for my company. So we need to be careful of some of the distinctions are a little bit nuanced. If I have 2 vehicles in my small SME, one is used for business travel and the other is used in the implementation of work activities. One is a Scope 1 emission for my company, and the business travel is a Scope 3 emission. Sometimes people maybe get that a little confused. Leased assets, upstream transportation, downstream transportation, processing or solid good. I've mentioned all of these before, but these are the 15 categories, and there's extensive literature available on investments as well, on banking organizations and how they are funding businesses. And at our training courses, in fact, we've had 4 global banks in attendance because the banks want to find out a little bit more about the emissions of the people they're funding, which is quite interesting. We had one bank who supplies finance, overnight finance to oil and not the oil and gas majors, but smaller independent operators who need a significant chunk of change overnight to hold on to a tanker of a 350,000 ton tanker in the Gulf heading for here, and they need overnight funds. Those banks have educated themselves in the requirements of greenhouse gas reporting, just to ensure that they're aware of what they're being asked to fund by way of debt or equity. These are emissions not covered by Scope 1 and 2 and are not the direct result, they are a result of our activities, but not the direct result of our activities. And again, we just have some examples there. Examples in the manufacturing of purchased raw materials, hydrogen or steel, emissions in third-party vehicles. There are many, many more. There are 15 categories, and within the categories, there are multiple individual elements as well of Scope 3 emissions. A Scope 3 emission can be quite significant for some businesses. We did some work for many law firms in the City of London, for example, and all of their emissions and their greenhouse gas inventories, between 92 to 96% were Scope 3 emissions from business travel. Rail, train, limo hire, car, Eurostar, and the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions were insignificant in comparison. So depending on your business, your Scope 2 profile can be quite large. For example, when we ship a 40-foot container from Ningbo Port to Felixstowe, the United Kingdom, that 40-foot container, typically, on average, from the databases we consult, emits 315 tons, 315 tons of CO2 equivalent. Some of these container ships might have 10,000 containers on. Each one would have a value of 315. That's the typical. A more modern ship is 280 or 285 tons of CO2 equivalent as a Scope 3. So if I'm buying furniture from China, for example, and selling it in the high street in an Irish town or village, and I said, this is low impact furniture. But to get a container load of that from China, well, to Felixstowe, it's 315 tons for the 40-foot container. It's probably a little bit more. I don't have the figures to offload that container in Dublin, Cork, or Foynes, for example, or Drogheda. But Scope 3 is often under the surface in our thinking, which is what we need to be careful of, I guess. Here's an example again from another business showing the distribution, as it were, throughout the business operation of the Scopes 1, 2, and 3. So what's in blue? It's an integrated oil and gas company. So extraction and production would add to their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Refining operations would add to their Scope 1 and Scope 2. Exploration and production company. The categories here, that's category 10 of the scope 3 emissions. So you will have this slide. So the green scope 3 emissions are upstream, raw materials, energy production that we purchase in, and scope 3 are downstream. So as you can see here, an integrated oil and gas company, of the 8 types of greenhouse gas emissions, only 2 are scope 1 and 2. 6 of them, or 75% of them, are scope 3. Even worse, in an oil and gas exploration and production company, only 1 of the 8 categories of emissions here, or classes I'll call them, not to confuse ourselves with the word scope or categories, of the 8 elements which contribute to the emissions of the exploration and production company, only 1 is directly under their control. 7 of them are outside their direct control and influence. So this, as you can see, for the exploration and production company is extensive. Scope 3 emissions are extensive. A refining company, again, 1 out of 8, and 1/8 of their emissions are under their direct control. 7/8 are external. A petrochemical company, this would be a further processing and added value company, a company which is getting in refined fossil materials and is making heptane or hexane or methanol, or they would have, well, I think they would have scope 1 and 2 because they operate catalytic crackers and so forth. Service stations, which doesn't have heating or electricity use, all of their emissions would be scope 3. So it's significant. I think the integrated oil and gas company, the exploration and production, and the refining company, 3 columns here, are quite interesting. I believe they show how significant our scope 3 profile is, and we may not be aware of it, because historically scopes 1 and scope 2 emissions were mandatorily reported, whereas scope 3 was regarded as an optional reporting category. Not anymore is it regarded as an optional reporting category. It's a category that we shall report, but obviously we cannot report all of our scope 3 profile emissions. That would be well nigh impossible. But we shall report those for which we can get accurate and verifiable and reasonable and robust data. We will come to that anon. So these are, I think the first 3 columns here are quite interesting. The principles of greenhouse gas quantification, and you will easily remember what the principles of greenhouse gas quantification are, ladies and gentlemen. In English, we say, if we want to keep ourselves focused or on the straight and narrow, or to keep ourselves on track, we can remember the principles by remembering the acronym TRACK: transparency, relevancy, accuracy, completeness, and consistency. And this just describes the various principles. These principles are the same in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 protocol, the corporate standards, ISO 14064, Global Greenhouse Gas Accounting and Reporting Standards for the financial industry, and many, many others. Even the European Union Emission Trading Scheme recognizes and promotes these principles of transparency, relevancy, accuracy, completeness, and consistency. Transparency, we address all relevant issues in a factual and coherent manner. Disclose all our assumptions and make appropriate references to calculations, and cite references you use in their quantification, like you used to do back in school and college, ladies and gentlemen. Relevance, we've got to define our organizational boundaries and our operating or reporting boundaries to reflect the actuality of what our business is doing. Well, accuracy is a difficult one, I would suggest. We must try and ensure that the calculations of our emissions are neither over or understated versus the actual emissions, as far as we can judge, and that we factor in uncertainties. And uncertainties are, greenhouse gas accounting, ladies and gentlemen, is beset with uncertainties of 3 types, actually. Scientific uncertainty. Are the scientists correct? Is the global warming for methane, is it 28? Is nitrous oxide, GWP, is that 265 today? Those are scientific uncertainties which we as operational people have no control over. But then there are model uncertainties and parameter uncertainties, which we can have a degree of control over by ensuring that our instruments are properly calibrated or within their calibration schedules or frequencies. Completeness, we account for all emission sources and activities within our organizational reporting boundaries. If we exclude any greenhouse gas emission, we should state why and justify the reason for or excluding of those scope 3 emissions, for example. And consistency, I think, is self-explanatory. Use consistent methodologies and measurements throughout to allow intended users or people consuming our greenhouse gas report to make a reasonable evaluation of the work we're doing. They're attracting, again, these Scope 3 emissions are attracting more and more attention, as it were, or more and more interest, especially so from some regulatory authorities. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive under the EU, there are mandatory standard operating procedures, or ESRS, as they call these, European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And reporting chapter entities under the CSRD. Some instances, some organizations are required to report their scope. At paragraph 45C, it states undertakings, like businesses, Scope 3 emissions may be the main component of their greenhouse gas inventory and are an important driver of the undertaking's transition risk. By the transition risk there, they mean the risk to businesses and enterprise posed by the transition inherent in new regulations such as CSRD, carbon taxes, managed jurisdictions, and carbon regulation. These are transition risks. Can company adapt in time? We might be good business people, but can we adapt to the new environment, the new reality? And again, at paragraph XX, the CSRD states at ESRS 1, disclosure of gross Scope 3 emissions shall include, which is interesting, in metric tons of each of CO2 equivalent from each significant Scope 3 category. So they're telling us there we have to identify which of our Scope 3 emissions are the significant ones. The calculation guidance suggests that ISO 14064 methods already meet much of the reporting needs under CSRD and its SOP ESRS E1. Specifically for Scope 3 emissions, the CSRD says farmers shall identify and disclose its significant Scope 3 categories based on the magnitude of their estimated greenhouse gas emissions and other criteria provided by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14061 at Annex H32, such as financial spend, influence, related transition risks and opportunities, or stakeholder views. The TFCD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, tells us all organizations should consider disclosing our Scope 3 emissions. So that's quite an august group of body. The Global Greenhouse Gas Accounting and Reporting Standards for the Financial Industry, the first edition. It talks about reporting our Scope 3 emissions in accordance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Value Chain Protocol. Beyond reporting Scope 3 category 15 emissions covered by the financial or finance investments, what are the Scope 3 emissions resulting from our investments? So this is the standard for the financial sector. And projects or initiatives or industries or factories that these financial institutions fund by way of finance, either equity finance, mezzanine finance, debt, these must be reported in conformance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Value Chain Protocol. Again, of course, it goes without saying that they must report their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That goes without saying. And again, just to remind us, emissions resulting from the banks, loans and investments fall under Scope 3 downstream emissions, more precisely Scope 3 category 15 investments, as I've already said. That financial reporting standard says for a financial institution, Scope 3 category 15 are often the most significant part of its greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And that is a fact, they are. And special consideration must be made regarding how these are measured. This now is an example of a transition risk, ladies and gentlemen, because the financial institutions will take this into consideration and will say, oh, hold on a minute. If I give money to oil company A, which is doing nothing on greenhouse gas emissions or climate change mitigation, or I could give it to oil company B, which is taking significant measures, for example, under the European Union Food Quality Directive, by reducing emissions at their upstream oil and gas installations. So this will impact where debt money and mezzanine finance may end up. So that is a clear transition risk, the availability of debt and equity, which is a transition risk related directly to our Scope 3 emissions. For some of us, Scope 3 reporting is not mandatory. It's not a requirement. Why should we bother if it's not mandatory? Most small and medium enterprises are outside the scope of the corporate sustainability reporting, but the EFRS Advisory Group, EFRAG, published a draft voluntary SOP for SMEs, voluntary SME standard in November of last year to support SMEs to help them provide sustainability information, which may be required by large customers who are their customers. We have many smaller companies, especially in Ireland, servicing TNCs, and the TNCs, the transnational corporations, will ask sustainability-related questions, specifically on climate change mitigation. It's under a public consultation at the moment, review which finishes the latter end of this month. And again, it says, it's the draft standard, it says, depending on the type of activities carried out by the undertaking, a quantification of their Scope 3 emissions provides relevant information. When such SMEs report Scope 3 emissions, the undertaking shall include significant Scope 3 categories as per the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate value chain, and based on its, this is an important point, on its own assessment of relevant. How do we do our own assessment of which of our Scope 3 emissions are significant and relevant and therefore should be included in our report and should be quantified? How do we come to that decision? We must have some justification or rationale for coming to the decision. And just as what an SME is here, well, Directive 2013-34 EU describes MSMEs, micro, small and medium enterprises based on balance sheet net turnover and number of employees. So a micro company, a small company, and a medium enterprise, so a micro enterprise. So sometimes rather than SMEs, you see the acronym MSME. The M means micro enterprises. So these company sizes are categorized in the directives listed there. Unlike the ESRS, the procedures for large corporates, the draft standard, it has no legal authority. It offers SMEs, or more precisely MSMEs, a voluntary tool for sustainability reporting. And again, Scope 3 emissions are important as they can represent the largest amount of emissions. They also may represent the most significant reduction opportunities. And it enables us, our business, to understand the full extent of what we're doing in terms of our emissions and our climate change additions. And just a recall in the light grey font there, just reminding us what Scope 3 emissions are. Broad range, yeah, as I mentioned this, when we're reporting our Scope 3 emissions, we include significant Scope 3 categories. How do we know what our significant Scope 3 emissions are? How do I know? How do I find out? Who can help me? Well, there are a number of ways. There are at least two. We can assess this by applying the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate value change accounting and reporting standard, specifically Chapter 6.3, and more scientifically, in my view, ISO 14064-1, Appendix H specifically, which gives us Scope 3 significance measurement tests. 10 tests to measure significance, which means that if we apply these tests, or those of them which we can, which our product is amenable to having the tests applied to, we will be able to stand up in any forum and defend our decision on which Scope 3 emissions we quantify. That is important to be able to defend what we do. We don't want to end up in front of an Oireachtas committee or a court of law or whatever the case may be on the lunchtime news, answering questions and stammering and stuttering our answer. So we need to have a quasi-scientific, at least, based significance test. And we have 10 such tests available to us. As I said, we test the principles, TRACC, we run that metric over the Scope 3 emissions, and then we do a scale or complexity test. Because we will be required to disclose and justify any Scope 3 exclusions in our public reporting. That's important, and that information will be available to everybody. So how do we test for them is the question. This is just something, before I get onto the tests, this is again why we should quantify scope 3 emissions if they're not manned. The National Health Service in the United Kingdom is quite interesting, and we've done work. We work a lot with the NHS, in fact, on assessing suppliers who are bidding for contracts worth over £5 million sterling. So we develop carbon reduction plans for companies, and then we assist with the assessment of carbon reduction plans. And the UK government has produced, I think the PPN means Public Procurement Notice 0621, which are guidelines for companies bidding for state contract on how to develop their greenhouse gas inventory and their carbon reduction plan, which is an excellent. I urge you all to download a copy of PPN 0621, freely available. Just Google PPN 061 or Bing it or whatever you use, and it gives you the detail of what you must do to satisfy your scope 1, scope 2, 3 reporting to get a contract worth more than £5 million per annum from the NHS. So this is quite very interesting, because the NHS in the United Kingdom as well, all the medical devices, all the medicines, all the PPE, all the hospital gowns, all the bed linen, all the bandages, all of those, the manufacturing and production and distribution to NHS of all of these are scope 3 emissions for the NHS. So this PPN 0621 helps the NHS to get a more precise handle on its scope 3 emissions, because its scope 3 emissions are significant. Worldwide, health services, if all the health services, such as the NHS in the UK and the HSE in the Irish Republic, if all of these were one individual sovereign country, they would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, including scopes 1, 2, and 3. They would be just behind the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, maybe one or two more, but they would be up in the top 5 at least. That varies year to year. So I think that's quite interesting. It's an example of how scope 3 is becoming rather important. And then we have 2 products here, carbon labeling. When they become mainstream, and carbon labeling is common. Many products have a carbon label, and there are rules associated with carbon labeling, many of them subject to ISO standards, particularly ISO 14067, which is the greenhouse gas standard for the carbon footprint of a product, which is quite interesting. And these are examples here. So a Logitech optical USB mouse, its manufacturing is 1.73 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And you can see that was clearly reviewed according to ISO, I'm not sure if you can read that, 14067 of 2018. That's the standard, which can be also verified. Such claims are then verifiable using ISO 14064 part 3. So that's quite interesting from Logitech, who have a manufacturing location in Cork. Carbon labeling, carbon footprinting across all scopes helps make us, our organization, our product, our service, more sustainable by highlighting areas for special attention. We should try and pick the low-hanging fruit first, as they say, because the last 10% of emission reductions are going to be the hardest to achieve. But at least if we measure what we're doing and where we're doing, we can identify, as the slide says, the hot spots which we need to address. Is it necessary to quantify? Well, these are the significant tests. This is an extract from ISO 14064 part 1, specifically section H3. This is the criteria to evaluate the significance of indirect or scope 3 emissions. And this needs to be consistent with the intended use of the inventory. This means, is it for CSRD purposes? Is it for NHS purposes? That's the purpose of our greenhouse gas inventory. So we consider the principles, the track principles: relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and transparency, which is RCCAT. Easy to remember if we rearrange the figures, the lead letters into transparency, relevancy, accuracy, completeness, and consistency. So we consider which indirect emissions need to be selected. Removal there means if we do a carbon dioxide removal project from the atmosphere. Not a lot of us do that. We do it, but it's not common practice. So our intended users might be our customers, might ask us to do that. Completeness, we should consider which scope 3 emissions need to be included in the inventory to include all relevant sources. Consistency, we should consider whether the inclusion of these scope 3 emissions are necessary for users to make a meaningful comparison between our product and a competitor's product. Accuracy, obviously, we need to be as accurate as possible, and transparency. We should consider whether exclusion of some Scope 3 emissions without disclosure justification impedes intended users from making informed decisions with reasonable confidence. That is the first 5 of our 10 tests. And then the second 5 of our significance tests. What we're trying to do here is establish which of our Scope 3 emissions we're going to include in our greenhouse gas reporting and which can be excluded. Ultimately, we would hope over the long term to include them all. So we look at 5 metrics: the magnitude, the indirect emissions which are assumed to be quantitatively. So if I'm making iPhones in China and shipping them to California or shipping them to Dublin port, well, the manufacturing of that iPhone in Shenzhen province and the shipping of that iPhone from Ningbo port to Felixstowe or Dublin or Limerick or Foynes, the magnitude of those emissions are significant. So Apple, for example, should include those in their corporate report. Level of influence: Samsung makes mobile phones just to distribute the naming of companies, and they make their phones are made by Foxconn in Shenzhen as well. So the phone manufacturer has a lot of influence over the phone assembly company. So because we have a lot of influence, we should be tempted, we should be encouraged, we should be motivated, we should be impelled to include the Scope 3 emissions from the manufacturing of our phones in China and the shipment of those phones from China to Europe or America. Risk or opportunity: are the Scope 3 emissions, can they contribute to our risk or exposure to risk? Financial risk, regulatory risk, supply chain, customer risk. If we don't include the Scope 3 emissions in our phone manufacturing, well then our Gen Z people might buy a phone from a company which does do the Scope 3 emission quantification. Some industries have sector-specific guidance. Aluminum. The IAI, the International Aluminum Institute, has a series of tools for aluminum smelters that they can use to quantify their Scope 3 emissions. So if there's sector-specific guidance published for your industry, giving you guidance on how to do the Scope 3 emissions, you should do them. Outsourcing, obviously. If I'm the Coca-Cola or the Fanta Orange delivery company of Limerick City and I have 100 trucks with 100 drivers, on Friday I decide to lay off my 100 drivers, but sell them the trucks at a knockdown rate. Then on Monday, those 100 trucks are delivering Coca-Cola around Munster as a Scope 3 emission for me. But I've outsourced the activity, which was last week, is Scope 1. So I should report that emissions. And then employee engagement. So of lesser importance in my view than the others, I would think. And then what to ask your suppliers about their Scope 3 emissions. These are the categories: Scope 3, Category 1 emissions, and purchase code. So where do we get information? Supplier, and you will get this, so I won't go through it all, but this gives 7 of the categories, well, actually 6 in full, what information you need to help you compile your Scope 3 inventory are shown there. And the next slide, I'm watching the clock here. The next slide, again, to quantify, we need data. Companies should prioritize data collection on the Scope 3 activities that are expected, that have come through our significance tests, our 10 significance tests. And again, collecting high quality data for priority activities allows companies to focus on the most significant, focus our efforts on the low hanging fruit, as it were, by obtaining data. Emissions quantification, so we can get data from our supplier. We can get supplier supplied data and maybe secondary data from public databases. Average data method estimates for emissions of goods by collecting data on the mass or weight and then spend. We can work out our Scope 3 emissions using certain enhanced environmental input-output models, such as produced by Yale University and the Journal of Industrial Ecology, who produce free models. So for various industrial categories, you have the spend, and from the spend in dollars, you get the emissions associated with each spend. So if you're a pharmaceutical R&D lab and you're buying glassware, you can go to the industry sector for for manufacturing glass and ceramics, glassware, laboratory supplies, and then I spent $10,000 on laboratory glassware last year, and that works out as 500 tons of CO2 equivalent. So the databases are there. There are multiple databases available. That's on the spend-based method. So again, we here we can use this is a diagram to give us which of the aforementioned 4 methods on the previous slide does the purchase good or service contribute significantly to my scope 3 emissions. If I answer yes to that question, is data available on the quantity of purchased goods or service? If that data is available, can the supplier, that's my immediate supplier, provide product level cradle to gate data? If he can, I use that. Based on our initial screening, does the good we buy or the service we buy contribute to our scope 3 emissions or is supplier engagement relevant? No. Are data available on the quantity of the goods purchased or the service? If we have no data available, we use the spend. So we use an enhanced environmental impact output model to show us how much we have spent on the laboratory glassware, for example, and use that to quantify our scope 3 emissions, and so on and so forth. Let me see. Note. Yeah, this is just an example which you can read in your own time. This is a company using cement plaster, how they worked out their emissions. So I know I'm at my time limit there, and push, so I don't want to overrun on the hour. So everyone will be able to read these because they're going to be supplied. Thank you. Any questions are welcome. Oh yes, those of you who attempted the pond lily question. The pond is covered by the leaves after 50 days. How long will it take to cover half the pond? Answers, does anyone wish to volunteer an answer? Or if not, I will just, my contact details are there as well, by the way. So will it take 25 days? It will take, and I'm sure most of you have figured it out by now, it will take 49 days to cover half of the surface of the pond.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
This is just a graph of how the pond works. And the problem is in climate change, day 40, well, what's the problem with my pond? Day 43, all looks okay. Only 0.78% of the pond is covered by the lilies. Here, 3% covered. Here, 6%, 12%, 25%, 50%. So the pond is just to tell us the scale of the climate change problem. And that's out from Fergal and Carbon Track. Over to you, Ankush.
Thank you so much, Fergal. That was very informative and very insightful. And there's a lot of information you covered. So definitely we will be sharing slides along with the webinar recording for everyone there. There are a few questions coming through. So in the interest of time, we will just move to the Q&A there, Fergal. So one of the questions there is related to business travel, and the person is asking attending meetings using van, which is owned by the company. How can you please elaborate on that? How they quantify as a scope 3 emissions?
So the question is, just to make sure I have it clear in my own mind, Ankush, is the person is asking if they use a company vehicle, a company-owned vehicle, attend a business meeting or a conference or some such, or a sales meeting.
Yeah,
that's business travel, typically company vehicles are provided to salespeople and business executives and managers for use in their work. So that would be a scope 3 emission. If that person was driving a company van delivering a product to the same venue, well, that would be a scope 1 emission for the company which owns and operates the vehicle. So business travel is always a scope 3 emission.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. There's another question. How long would the exercise of identifying significant scope 3 emissions normally take?
That's a very interesting question. If I was Chevron Texaco Oil Company in North America, it would take quite a while. Whereas if I was a bookshop in Stevens Green, it would take much less time. It depends on the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. So if I operate 50 data centers across Britain and Ireland, that would take a little bit longer than if I operate one cement plant in Limerick, maybe. But to run the test, once we've identified the potential scope 3 emissions, that's the first part of the exercise. Identify all the potential or possible or plausible scope 3 emissions. Once these are identified, to run the 10 tests over it, you'd have it done in no more than half a day, I would think, to run the test. But the biggest data trawl and data acquisition will be the identification of all of the plausible scope 3 emissions, I would think. But the question is difficult to give a down pat answer because, as I said at the outset, it depends on the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. I would suggest.
Great. You gave a couple of sector-specific examples in the presentation, Fergal. So, does companies have any tools or resources that are sector-specific they can use to quantify Scope 3 emissions?
Absolutely. The IAI, that's the International, I'll pronounce it, they're American-based, the International Aluminum Institute, has provided sector-specific guidance for aluminium producers on which of their Scope 3 emissions they should quantify. That's a sector-specific guidance. The oil and gas industry produce two very significant works. One is the IPIECA, that's the International Petroleum Institute's Environmental Conservation Association, produced two guidances, what to quantify for oil and gas operators, exploration and production, upstream, refining. They provide guidances on what you should include. And in parallel with the IPI, that's the International Petroleum Institute's Environmental Conservation Association, we have from the United States, we have the API, the American Petroleum Institute, which publishes what is called their Greenhouse Gas Compendium, which gives detailed, very rigorous and strenuous and detailed how to quantify scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. If you're repairing a centrifugal compressor at a gas pipeline pumping station, it goes as far as if you change the butadiene O-rings in this centrifugal compressor driven by a gas turbine, how do I work out the Scope 3 emissions caused by me at the manufacturer's site in making the spare filters or O-rings or seals or gaskets? It goes into hugely significant detail. So that's the International Aluminum Institute, the American Petroleum Institute, the International Petroleum Institute, and many more. The International Wind Energy Agency as well will provide details on embedded emissions in wind turbines, for example. So check if you're a member of an industry group. But there are examples. The wine manufacturers have something similar. Okay. For the dairy sector, you have the International Dairy Federation, which provides guidelines to dairy producers, the casein, lactose, milk, cheese, liquid milk, chocolate businesses. So there are multiple associations or trade associations available.
Great. And in the interest of
Does
time,
that help with the question?
Yeah, and just the last question there. Are we not duplicating the emissions quantify if we include transport, steel, raw materials, etc.?
No, we're not. That's why the Greenhouse Gas Protocol invented the concept of scopes, or why the International Standards Organization has the concept of direct emissions, energy indirect emissions, or other indirect emissions. It's to avoid double counting, or even worse than double counting, is half counting. So everyone's Scope 3 emission has been the Scope 1 or Scope 2 emission of someone else in the supply chain. So no is the answer. And that's why we have 3 scopes. Well, actually, I guess you could say we have 4 scopes, because the carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of biofuels are not to be included in Scope 1. So we have 3 scopes and an out-of-scope emission source, really. But that's why we have those scopes 1, 2, and 3, to avoid the problem that the questioner raises, which is a legitimate and valid question.
Very well explained. Thank you, Fergal, for that. So before we finish, I would just like to highlight that all the webinars we've had this year in the 2024 webinar series and in 2023 webinar series last year's are recorded and are available on the Enterprise Ireland's website in the on-demand webinar section. And also, just to highlight the Enterprise Ireland client supports, we have a range of support from training and consultancy supports to develop a metering roadmap, to develop a carbon reduction roadmap, or to calculate your organization's or your product's carbon footprint, to implement an energy management system. We also have a range of capital supports to install meters and to decarbonize manufacturing processes, which can help you move away from fossil fuel. for installing heat pumps, installing heat recovery, or similar carbon abating technology. So you can find more information on the Enterprise Ireland supports available in the Become More Sustainable section on the Enterprise Ireland's website, or the client companies of Enterprise Ireland can contact their development advisor. And also any clients from IDA, UDROS, or local enterprise offices can get in touch with the relevant agencies. But if you need any further information on these, you can always email us at green@enterprise-ireland.com. So thank you so much for joining us for first leg of the 2024 Green Transition webinar series. We plan to host more webinars on the range of sustainability topics in the later half of the year. So we will put more information on that once it's available on the Enterprise Ireland's website. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Fergal, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you, Ankush. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.